At the dawn of the 20th century, the Royal Navy was the guarantor of Britain's imperial interests. Her mighty dreadnoughts were the most powerful ships in the world. But as Europe slid towards war in 1914, the dominance of the surface fleet faced two new threats: the submarine and the aeroplane. The Admiralty had been quick to grasp the aeroplane's military potential and had formed its own air arm, the RNAS, in 1912. During the First World War, the service expanded rapidly, using land-based aircraft as well as experimenting with a variety of seaplanes and flying boats to carry out reconnaissance duties. Among them was the Short 184, which proved outstanding in terms of quantity and quality. At least 650 were built, and it became the standard patrol seaplane.
Seaplanes were used from land bases, but also the Admiralty wanted the advantage that aircraft could offer to the fleet by observation from a height, which you couldn't gain otherwise. So seaplanes were carried by certain warships. The Short 184 had wings that could be folded back, and these were used, being carried on the deck and could be lowered onto the water. The wings expanded, the engines started, and the seaplane could take off, could conduct its patrol, report back to the ship, land near the ship, and be picked up and hauled back on board by crane. This happened at the Battle of Jutland, incidentally, when a Short 184 seaplane was the first detection of the German fleet and was able to give warning to Admiral Jellicoe exactly where the fleet was and in which course it was steaming.
Britain's most significant flying boat during the First World War was the Felixstowe. Originally based on an American flying boat designed by Glenn Curtiss, the Felixstowe gave good active service against the Zeppelins that were sent to bomb British cities. They also played an important role in the fight against a new menace that emerged during the First World War, the U-boat. As an island, Britain's war effort depended on supplies from abroad to feed and arm her population. It was vital that the sea lanes were kept open. Although the surface vessels of Germany's high seas fleet was effectively blockaded and confined to port, her submarines could slip through the net more easily to threaten merchant ships. However, submarines could only stay submerged for a limited period as they depended on batteries for their power. They would then have to surface and recharge their batteries. This was when the U-boats were at their most vulnerable. Spotting the grey hull of a surfaced U-boat against a grey sea from another vessel was all but impossible. But from an aeroplane, they were much more visible. Thus, the two new technologies of the Great War, the submarine and the aeroplane, locked horns in combat almost as soon as they were invented. The outcome was indecisive when the war ended in 1918, but it would only be another 20 or so years before the contest would be resumed. On April 1st, 1918, Britain's Royal Air Force was formed from the amalgamation of the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. For the Admiralty, it was a bitter blow. By giving up its air service, the Royal Navy lost at a stroke nearly 3,000 aircraft and 55,000 officers and men. Peace in 1918 was followed by a sharp reduction of Britain's armed forces. The newly formed Royal Air Force almost faced extinction as 3 instead of 2 armed services now fought over ever-diminishing defense budgets. But despite the best attempts of the Army and Admiralty to seize control of its assets, the Royal Air Force survived. In April 1924, the fleet fighter, spotter, reconnaissance and torpedo flights came under the umbrella of the Fleet Air Arm of the Royal Air Force. But when on board ship, these flights were to be operationally controlled by the Admiralty. The defense of Britain's coastal waters remained under RAF control. During the early 1920s, the RAF struggled on with adaptations of aircraft from the First World War. For example, the Bristol F-2 fighter had proved to be a very effective machine in the last 2 years of the war. After the war, Bristol continued to develop the type for use in other roles such as Army cooperation and as a seaplane. Although the Rolls-Royce Falcon was the original engine in the F2, engines such as Hispano-Suizes, Sunbeams, Wolseley and Bentley, among many others, were tried when orders outstripped supply. Incredibly, the Bristol F2 and its derivatives were to stay in RAF service until 1932. Another successful World War I design to provide useful maritime service was the Fairey 3. Indeed, some were still in service in 1941. But the first significant post-war design to enter RAF maritime service was the Supermarine Southampton. Flying boats were on the point of becoming extinct following several expensive failures, and so this elegant machine, ordered straight off the drawing board of R.J. Mitchell, saved the day for the flying boat. The first Southamptons had wooden hulls, and elegant though they undoubtedly were, the wood soaked up some 400 pounds of water. A new Mark II version was designed using a lightweight metal covering called duralumin, which gave a significant increase in performance. The Southampton entered service in 1925 with the RAF's number 480 coastal reconnaissance flight.
A wooden contraption to start with, a really old-fashioned, well, not old-fashioned, it was modern, I suppose, when it was built. And then it was produced later on in metal form, and it was used everywhere and did some very long flights overseas, I think, in its time. Again, things have changed. You had to get out on the wing and put a starting handle into a cog, as you did ancient motor cars, and turn it round to start up the engines, now climb back aboard again, and open cockpits too in the Southampton. Yeah, fine, solid aeroplane.
Nicknamed Old Faithful by her crews because of her dependability, the Southampton was the start of a golden age for the flying boat. During the years between the two world wars, the RAF found its ethos and guaranteed its survival by patrolling the more inaccessible corners of Britain's enormous empire. Flying boats helped to extend that reach, epitomised in 1927 and 28 by Southamptons of the Far East flight completing a 24,000-mile cruise to Singapore without a hitch. It was one of many fleet exercises and extended cruises which provided much-needed experience of operating from temporary bases.
We used to do what we called a med cruise. We used to go out to land at Lisbon, which is a bit hairy, as a matter of fact, because the Tagus seems to run very fast, and the buoys we had to tie up to were large metal ones, not the rather nice rubber ones which we've been used to. And if you had made a mistake on approaching your metal buoy, you could either take your float off or take a wing off or do a lot of damage. Anyway, and from there we used to go down to Gib, I suppose, and then to Malta, and then across probably to Bizerta Lake. They were great fun and very good experience for all the crews, really, because in the case of Bizerta, which is quite a big lake, but absolutely dead calm, and we had a full load of petrol to get back, because we were going to, I think, trying to get back to Gib. And the lads just couldn't get off, so we had to stop and all refuel again to fill up the tanks. And I said, look, what I'll do, I'll skimmy around the lake. I'm not going to try and take off. I'm just going to make as many little waves as I can, and you just take off in my that. So I did that, and they in turn took off in what little breaks. But if you can't break a calm sea, it's very difficult to get a flying boat off it. They get stuck. They've got to be broken. There's a suction.
Although the Southampton had few crew comforts, it provided the basic pattern and a foundation of hard experience for subsequent RAF flying boats and their crews.
The Navy and Air Force have been working together on training exercises off the Firth of Forth.
As well as cruises to far-flung corners of the globe, there were exercises in home waters aimed at testing Britain's defences.
Which is defended by a blue force composed of aircraft alone.
Unfortunately, these exercises tended to be carried out in favourable conditions, with the ships cruising at slow speed in broad daylight. It only served to enhance the false sense of security that existed in the minds of many of Britain's military planners in the years building up to the Second World War.
Now Hawker Hots are ordered to launch an attack on the located battleships. And Gordon day bombers follow the Hots into the air. The coast of Scotland seized with aircraft speeding to repel the friendly foe. Now the battleships are sighted, steaming slowly for the purposes of these exercises and in broad daylight, and the aircraft prepare to attack. Renowned warspiter Malaya turn out of line to avoid the attack.
From 1928, Coastal Area began disbanding its flights and reforming them as squadrons. On January the 1st, 1929, number 480 flight reformed as number 201 Squadron. Flying boats had become enormous as both civilian and military operators recognized that they were the fastest means available of transporting numbers of people and cargo over large distances. By 1929, the flying boat had reached gargantuan proportions, epitomized by the Dornier Do-10. At the same time, the RAF was receiving the mighty Blackburn Iris, which was also the largest aircraft in RAF service. The Mark III entered RAF service in 1930 with number 209 Squadron as a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. It had a metal hull and was powered by 3 Rolls-Royce Condor engines, producing a top speed of 118 miles per hour. This flying giant had a wingspan of nearly 100 feet, and it needed a crew of 5 to operate her. But this period of modest expansion was to be short-lived as world recession loomed. Replacement boats were ordered, but in alarmingly small numbers. For example, Blackburn developed the Iris and rechristened it the Perth. Again, its role was long-range reconnaissance, but only 3 aircraft entered RAF service in 1934, again with number 209 Squadron. The Perth had 3 Rolls-Royce Buzzard engines, which gave it a top speed of 132 miles per hour. With a range of 1,500 miles, it had twice the endurance of the Iris. The crew's comfort was also improved by the addition of an enclosed cockpit. The Perth entered RAF service at the same time as another giant flying boat from Short's Brothers, the Sarafand. It was built in 1932 as a patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. At 33 tons, it must have made a truly spectacular sight as it taxied out from its moorings on the River Medway in Kent, where Short's built many of its flying boats. The Sarafand needed 6 Rolls-Royce Buzzard engines to lift it off the water. The engines were arranged in pairs of tractor and pusher units, producing around 5,500 horsepower. Only one Sarafand was built and operated by the RAF, But her service life was brief, and in 1936 she was scrapped. Meanwhile, Supermarine had been developing the highly successful Southampton. A new version designated the Mark IV was delivered to No. 202 Squadron in 1935. By then, it had been renamed the Scarpa. The Scarpa differed from the earlier Southamptons in a number of ways, the most noticeable features being the neater installation of two Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines in nacelles under the top wing. It also had an enclosed cockpit, replacing the open tandem arrangement of the older models. Also, the triple fins of the Southampton were replaced by a twin-fin layout. Perhaps less obvious, but no less significant, was the change to an all-metal structure, with fabric used to cover the aerodynamic surfaces. A Mark V Southampton was also proposed, entering service in 1936 as the Stranraer. Although closely related to the Scarpa, the Stranraer was a considerably larger aeroplane. It was powered by two Bristol Pegasus radial engines and introduced a gun turret in the tail.
We were designing and building the Stranraer, which was one of the successors to the Southampton series. And the design work was split. Supermarine design team designed the hull, and the Weybridge design team designed the wings and engine installation. So, and I mean, all right, the Stranraer flew, and it wasn't a bad aeroplane, but it was far, far overweight. And I think it might well have been that particular experience which decided the Vickers organisation that one team did one thing and one did another, and don't split it up.
It really was basically a London built by another firm, a London very similar airplane, except that I think the engines, I forget what they were, but they were very reliable. We never had any engine trouble. And I wouldn't say that it had anything. We used it for all sorts of important things. And I remember I had one job I was given to me. I was told to go up to Holyhead. I was to pick up an important passenger and take him across to Londonderry, drop him off and come back again. And I discovered I was taking the Secretary of State for Air across to see Lord Longford at Lochern, I think it is. And I know that rather surprised me, because I thought that was a solid internal lake, and I thought we were going to stay there for the weekend. But when the crew came to me and said, "These reeds round here are growing very fast, aren't they?" And I realised it was tidal, so I had to up anchor and take off and go across to, I think I went across to Stranraer for the weekend. We had moorings. Flying boat people had moorings at Londonderry, Stranraer, Oban and Queensferry, I think. So, and of course Scilly's. Scilly's a very, very popular place.
The same year as the Stranraer entered service saw the first flight of his greatest creation, the Spitfire. Mitchell had learned much about high-speed flight while designing a series of mono-winged float planes in the late 1920s and early 1930s. They were built to compete in the Schneider Trophy, which was one of the blue-ribboned sporting events of the era. The RAF had formed a high-speed flight in order to provide experienced pilots to compete in the competition. In Venice in 1927, Supermarine wiped the board with the stunning S5 powered by a Napier Lion engine. The winning aircraft flew at an average speed of nearly 282 miles per hour. But the pace of development was such that the next two races would see aircraft capable of far greater speeds. Mitchell had been introduced to Rolls-Royce, and together they designed an all-new aircraft in which to compete in the 1929 race to be held at Supermarine's home water at Carlshot, near Southampton. Flying Officer Waghorn won the race in a Supermarine S6 at an average speed of over 328 miles per hour. The dominance of the Supermarine aircraft and their Rolls-Royce engines was such that nobody wanted to challenge the British for the next race, to be held in 1931. But to underline the point, Supermarine, this time backed by a private benefactor, flew the course at Culshot anyway. The average speed was raised to 340 miles per hour, and Britain got to keep the Schneider Trophy forever. That same day, September the 13th, Flight Lieutenant Stainforth flew the reserve Supermarine S6B at 379 miles per hour, which was a new absolute world speed record. It also threw the spotlight on the inadequacy of funding by the Air Ministry in aircraft development. For the Supermarine S6B was 150 miles per hour faster than the RAF's latest fighter, the Gloucester Gauntlet, which was entering service at the same time.
The S6, which had a different engine, that was a Rolls-Royce engine instead of the Napier engine, and that involved quite different problems in terms of cooling and so on. The S6B, which flew in the 1931 race, was an uprated Rolls-Royce engine and had to have a great deal more cooling and obviously much greater fuel flow and everything else. Mitchell described the S6B as a flying radiator because we had to dissipate so much heat everywhere. In fact, when the thing came down, the pilot, I'm told, had to be very careful getting out of the cockpit not to burn his hands on the oil coolers, because the oil coolers ran right along the side of the fuselage.
The achievement of Supermarine and Rolls-Royce might have been meaningless, but for the fact that it cemented a relationship that would prove vital to the nation in the years that followed.
It gave us a lot of experience with high-speed flight. That was extremely important. And of course it gave the company a very important image within the industry and internationally. And of course, as you know, we won the 1927 race, the 1929 race, the 1931 race. I saw the 29 and the 31 races from the middle of the course in the Solent. But it certainly did. It left us with the design and aerodynamic knowledge to go on to high-speed aircraft. And of course, from that, the Spitfire finally evolved.
But the government was becoming increasingly alarmed at German rearmament. Following a powerful speech in the House of Commons by Winston Churchill in July 1934, the mood both in Parliament and the country at large began to change, resulting in an increase in defence expenditure. But it would take time for new, faster monoplane designs to appear. In the meantime, the RAF had to continue fulfilling its maritime obligations with biplane designs like the Vickers Vincent, which superseded the venerable Fairey 3D in 1934. It was intended as a general-purpose aircraft, expected to perform a wide variety of roles. As it had a range of over 1,200 miles, it proved very useful in the Middle East, where it remained in service until early 1942. Similarly, the short Singapore was a conventional design, which also proved to be very successful in the coastal reconnaissance role. The type began life in 1931 as the Singapore Mark I and was used by Alan Cobham for his 23,000-mile survey flight around the African continent. But it was not until 1935 that the Singapore, now as a Mark III version, entered RAF service. The 4 Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines were arranged in 2 pairs, as tractor and pusher units and produced a top speed of 145 miles per hour with a range of 1,000 miles. The Singapore provided many thousands of trouble-free flying hours over several seas and oceans until it was retired in mid-1941.
Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force provides pictorial news again, and another squadron of Singapore 3 flying boats take off for Singapore, bringing the establishment for the base up to 4 squadrons. The huge 4-engine machines normally carry a crew of 6 and are to be employed on open sea duties.
At the same time, Shorts had built a civilian version of the Singapore Mark I, but powered by 3 Bristol Jupiter radial engines. Called the Calcutta, it was the first stressed metal-skinned flying boat to enter service. Shorts was eager to capitalize on this achievement by building a military version, which was renamed the Rangoon. Eventually, 6 were built and delivered to No. 203 Squadron in Basra in 1931. During the 1930s, Shorts experimented with a variety of flying boat designs, not all of which were successful.
Built on generous lines, the ship is 63 feet long and stands 20 feet out of the water.
The knuckle duster, specified in 1931, was an early attempt at a mono-winged flying boat. Intended as a fighter reconnaissance aircraft, the Rolls-Royce Goshawk engines proved too unreliable, and so it remained as a prototype.
Our new coast defender is intended for open sea reconnaissance. Rumour here on the Medway credits her with phenomenal speed, but actual figures are a closely guarded Air Ministry secret. She's all metal, well armed, is manned by 5 men and weighs 8.5 tons. Back she comes with flying colours. Perhaps she'll be the forerunner of many more like her, to keep Britain supreme in the air as well as on the sea.
Short's next monoplane, however, would prove to be one of the most successful aircraft of the Second World War. In 1936, the company had begun building the exquisite S-23 Empire, or C-class flying boats. Most of the S-23s were taken into RAF service at the outbreak of war, during which they performed a wide variety of roles, including resupply and medical evacuation.
With a beautiful takeoff, she gets into the air. Movietone aloft in a 150-mile-an-hour plane is soon outdistanced by the amazingly powerful flying boat.
But it was with the arrival of the Sunderland into RAF service in 1938 with No. 230 Squadron that the flying boat reached its zenith. Early versions were powered by 4 Bristol Pegasus engines, but the last version, the Mark V, was given 4 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radials, which gave it a range of over 2,600 miles and an endurance of over 13 hours.
My first feeling was, yes, well, this needs a bit of getting used to. It's quite a heavy aircraft and rolling about, and you know, to manually fly a Sunderland wasn't all that easy. I mean, you had automatic pilot, which of course you used most of the time, good old George, but actually manually handling it after a much lighter aircraft, I think it did come as a bit of a surprise.
With the Sunderland, they had gouge-type flaps. Gouge was a chap who really designed the Sunderland. And you set your trim up before takeoff. It was only about 2 degrees nose up on the elevator trim. And it stayed there virtually the whole trip. You didn't touch it. You put 1/3 flap out for takeoff, and when you brought it in, there was no trim change at all. And when you even dropped it under full flaps, there was still no trim change. So it was very stable in that sense. And also in other angles of flight. Approach and landings were quite stable. We stuck the 1/3 flap out. We used to do, in daytime, normally did glide landings, and we also had a lot of spark plug trouble, being sort of gummed up with you know, oil and all the rest of it. We didn't realise at the time all right through the war, actually. It wasn't until I got into British Overseas Airways, where we did powered approaches on the flying boats, that I realised what the problem was. And when you throttle back, of course, a lot of oil goes into the cylinders and all that sort of business, and that gummed up the plug. With a powered approach, of course, you didn't have that problem. And it was also easy on the passengers. Doing a glide landing with a passenger, it was a rather steep approach, and it would have upset them. So oiling up of plugs was one thing, but apart from that, they worked very well. Another thing, of course, with the Sunderland was we'd never had feathering air screws until later on the war they modified the aircraft with Pratt & Whitney engines, so that if you lost an engine, you still had if the prop stayed on, with the prop windmilling, it created quite a bit of drag. And with a heavy load, of course, there was only one way you could go, and that was down. So you had to start throwing things out. The skipper always went last, of course.
In 1936, the RAF had reorganized into commands based on function rather than location. Thus, Coastal Area became Coastal Command. At the same time, the Admiralty finally won its battle to have its aircraft back. The Fleet Air Arm and RAF once more parted company. It was a relief as it removed the inter-service friction that had existed since 1918. However, the defense of coastal area, and even more crucially, the convoys of merchant shipping, remained the responsibility of the RAF. But there were many aspects to operating flying boats that suggested a closer link to the Navy rather than the Air Force.
We called ourselves the Web-footed Air Force, and I mean, there's no doubt about it that we had a lot of naval language, practices. I mean, we adopted a watch system. I mean, so many hours on, then you changed to watch. We talked about on the aircraft, we had the galley, the wardroom, and the companionways, and the pilot's area was called the bridge. So, I mean, you know, there were naval terms all the way, and of course we had to learn seamanship. I mean, we had this business of when we were getting out to the aircraft or to the takeoff point, it was quite difficult actually taxiing amongst the sort of busy shipping lanes and things like that. You know, Milford Haven was quite a busy sort of area at that time when we were at Pembroke Dock.
By 1939, the functions of Coastal Command had been clearly defined as reconnaissance in home waters, cooperation with the Navy in convoy protection, and counter-offensive action in defense of seaborne trade. Offensive operations were still secondary to the reconnaissance role, as the Admiralty was confident that it could deal with the German U-boats and surface fleet on its own, and that attacking ports was Bomber Command's responsibility. It was because of this that Coastal Command continued to receive limited supplies of aircraft and armament. However, the Admiralty's view that the main threat to convoys would come from surface vessels was severely challenged when the SS Athenia, the Royal Oak, and the aircraft carrier Courageous were all sunk within the first few weeks of the war by U-boats, which had slipped out of their ports undetected in the weeks before war was declared. Also, despite retaining a considerable naval force in home waters to counter the threat of the surface raiders, there was a very real possibility that they could slip undetected out into the North Atlantic to operate independently against the convoys. The problem was made worse when France fell in 1940, as the Germans now had access to the French Atlantic ports. Not only could the surface raiders reach safe haven more quickly, but the U-boats would have more time out at sea, enabling them to attack shipping farther out in the Atlantic. It was the worst possible scenario for Coastal Command, as it would stretch the already limited resources to breaking point. But it became the reality. The crews and aircraft of Coastal Command now faced having to patrol even further out into the Atlantic in search of U-boats and the mighty German surface raiders, such as the Bismarck. At stake was Britain's very survival. Without the convoys, the nation would starve.
The standard patrol was either 13 or 13 and a half hours, and I have done 18 hours, at least, yes, I certainly did 18 plus at one time. But yes, well, but then we had a big crew, you see. I mean, we had 12 on the Sunderland crew when I was there. We had 3 pilots, 1 navigator, 2 flight engineers, well, flight engineer and flight mechanic engines. It was a more lowly bod, but they were 2, I called them 2 engineers. 4 wireless operators, and 2 straight air gunners. The pilots seemed to be a luxury, 3 pilots, but they were supposed to help out with the navigation because they were been trained as navigators as well. But I never knew a self-respecting navigator that would ever let a pilot anywhere near his charts. And so there was always, if you like, a spare pilot, but then you did these watches, so you flew for the first hour per first pilot's seat. Second hour you transferred to the second pilot's seat, keeping a lookout all the time. And then the spare pilot was off. I mean, he might be having a meal down below in the wardroom next door to the galley. They could cook a decent meal for him. Or he might be in the loo. We had a flushing loo downstairs, very nice. And there were bunks in the wardroom, and you could have a sleep if necessary. And so, you know, we took this watch system. We did have long trips, but we spread the load between the people. The same with the other people, like the wireless operators. They were either, one was on the radio set, one was on the radar, and 2 were probably in the turrets because they were WAP-AGs, air gunners as well. And so they did their turn in the turrets. And the engineers also did their turn in the turrets. And, you know, on the whole, the navigator was the only poor chap who was glued to his charts all the time.
Well, we did all sorts of jobs actually with the Sunderland, but the main object of the operation in Coast Command was anti-submarine work, which included convoy work, of course. And that varied from convoy work, of course, to doing anti-submarine patrols. Later on, before I left to go back to Australia in 1942, we were doing a lot of patrols from Mountbatten and Plymouth in the Bay of Biscay area. Anything from the 100 fathom line to into the 50 miles of Brest and St Nazaire in that part of the world. And because there was a reasonably shallow water out to the 100 fathom line, and we covered that area to try and make the submarine stay under the water until they got the 100 fathom lines, and by then they'd used their batteries up and they had to come to the surface anyhow. And you happened to be at that spot at the time, well, there was a chance of getting them.
I think it was a game of cat and mouse to some extent between us and the U-boats, because they were wanting to come up when we weren't there and sort of have a reconnoitre, have a look to see what was happening, and also to, as I say, to recharge their batteries. And we, on the other hand, were wanting to be there when they did. And of course, radar came into this a lot because we were able to spot things from a distance and hopefully be in the right position at the right time.
Well, in the early part of the war, they're very difficult to see. They're not like later in the war when Donetsk said that they had to stick on the surface and fight it out. Then they started to get the submarines. But halfway through the war, shall I say, they were difficult things to find. You can imagine, in a rough sea in particular, and mostly the Atlantic was the surface was broken one way or another. And they had a form of detection on the radar. They get a signal from our radar and warning that you're around. And mostly, the ones I saw about 8 of them, I suppose, and I got credited with half of one, if you call it. When you spotted them, they're well ahead of you. Well, not ahead of you, but they were normally you spotted them ahead, of course. And they'd obviously seen you, and they were on the way down. By the time you got to the spot, they'd gone. And with a broken sea, of course, no hope of seeing them beneath the surface. Anyhow, the Atlantic's a pretty mucky bit of water anyhow, and even in the best of conditions, the visibility down through the water was practically non-existent.
The lack of aircraft was eased a little by the arrival of the consolidated Catalina in RAF service in early 1941. The aircraft had been designed in 1933 to meet the requirement of the US Navy for a long-range flying boat capable of carrying a substantial payload. In July 1939, an example had been flown across the Atlantic for evaluation at the Marine Aircraft Experimental Establishment at Felixstowe, Suffolk. Although the trials ended abruptly with the outbreak of war, there was little doubt that this was an excellent aircraft, and an order for 50 was placed immediately. Over the next 4 years, the RAF would buy 700 Catalinas, helping to make it the most extensively built flying boat in aviation history. The Catalina was a design masterpiece. For example, the parasol wing incorporated internal bracing, so that, with the exception of the 2 small struts between the hull and the wing, it was free of the drag-inducing bracing wires and struts which had limited the performance of earlier types. Another innovation was the use of stabilizing floats that could be retracted during flight to form streamlined wingtips. Power was supplied by 2 Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp radials mounted on the wing's leading edge. With a range of over 2,500 miles, the Catalina was to play a vital role in all theatres of war.
The Catalina was a lovely old airplane. It was much slower in the sun, and we cruised at 90 knots, where the sun was 120 knots. And on the subject of floats, the float section on the Catalina was far more substantial as it retracted, and could take a greater impact. And also, having retractable floats, it had its advantages in taking off, where once you got aileron control, which was about 40, 50 knots, we'd wind up the floats, so there's less resistance and gave you a little bit more lift on the wings.
The United States was also to play a vital role in the training of aircrew, where they could learn to fly in good weather, safe from possible attack by marauding German aircraft.
I was on what they called the towers posting. The Americans had 2 systems. One was the Arnold system, which General Arnold was in charge of the US Army Air Corps, and I was on the Towers posting, which was Admiral Towers, who was in charge of the US Naval Air Service. And first of all, I went to Grosse Ile, which is on the outskirts of Detroit, and did 3 months there, preliminary. And then I went on to Pensacola in Florida, where we again did certain things like formation flying and instrument flying. But on our final thing, we went on to flying boats. And whereas the Fleet Air Arm, who had been in parallel with us at training up to then, they went on to sort of specialize in deck landings and so forth. And we went on to a rather primitive type of flying boat called a P2Y, which was made by Consolidated and was a sort of semi-biplane. It had a rather short bottom wing and looked as if it had been held together by bits of string. And then we went on and finished on Catalinas, so I finished on Catalinas at Pensacola.
As the Battle of the Atlantic raged, Coastal Command was forced to patrol ever greater distances in the quest to provide protection for the convoys.
Well, the Navy, I think Coastal Command should have been part of the Navy myself, because we're in close contact with them all the time, and especially on convoy work. And we were, let's say, the same frequencies, but when we're on convoys doing, had 2 sorts of patrols really, there were, well, 3 I suppose. You had a creeping line ahead of the convoy where you went out about 5 miles and you turned 45 degrees starboard at right angles to the track you were heading in originally over the convoy. And then back to the convoy, and you did that all day. Now and again you do talked about the single aircraft, and normally a single aircraft on a convoy in those days. Aircraft were pretty scarce, and we'd occasionally do a circuit round the convoy and then back onto this pattern again. And occasionally you go down the rear of the convoy and go a few miles behind, because the submarines used to chase these things all day and then attack them at night.
But on the 21st of May 1941, the mighty German battleship Bismarck was able to slip through the cordon of air and sea patrols and out into the North Atlantic. A frantic game of cat and mouse began as aircraft and ships tried to locate the menace. On May the 24th, she was spotted by a Sunderland from number 201 Squadron. But it was too late. Bismarck was engaged by capital ships of the Royal Navy. In the ensuing engagement, HMS Hood was sunk with terrible loss of life. That night, Swordfish from HMS Victorious attacked the Bismarck with torpedoes and succeeded in rupturing her fuel tanks. But bad weather intervened and Bismarck managed to shake off her pursuers. In the frantic search by air and sea that followed, a Catalina from 209 Squadron spotted her on the 26th. A second Catalina from number 240 Squadron helped to shadow her until the aircraft carrier Ark Royal gained contact. Bismarck's fate was sealed when torpedoes from Ark Royal's Swordfish damaged her steering gear. After a battering from the guns belonging to ships of Force H and the Home Fleet, Bismarck was finally sent to the bottom of the sea by torpedoes fired from the Dorsetshire. Hood had been avenged. Sunderlands and Catalinas gave the RAF a real advantage in its offensive operations against submarines and surface vessels in all the main theatres of conflict, from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean to the Pacific.
We were bombing the Solomon Islands, Book of Passage and all these places where the Japs were fighting the Americans, and up as far as Rabaul in New Britain and down the Lea and various islands around that area where the Japs were. And we used to set off from Cairns in the afternoon and did a 20-hour trip. It was roughly 1,000 miles each way, and nothing much in between. And with a load of general purpose bombs with an extension on the nose fuse, it was a rod which had a flat bit at the bottom, and when it hit the ground, it burst above the ground because we were bombing the coconut trees and sand and stuff. And if you used a bomb normally, they'd just dig a hole and that'd be it, knock a few coconuts off the trees. But the object was to get the Japs, of course. And then we were really overloaded because the Catalina carried the same bomb load as the Sunderland, which was 2,000 pounds. That was the basic bomb load, but we overloaded the Cats a bit. And we carried inside the hull 20-pound frags, 25-pound incendiaries, which were thrown out through the blister at the appropriate time, because sometimes we stayed up there all night sort of thing, and just to keep the Japs out of bed. And then we carried numerous beer bottles, which we fitted a razor blade in the neck, which made twice as much noise as an empty beer bottle, just to keep them out of bed sort of thing. You couldn't tell the difference between a bomb and a beer bottle. And then my armourer on the aircraft had his own pet gadget, and that was a Mills bomb. He used to catch these big Mills bombs off the Australian Army, and he tied a tennis ball to the pins, or tennis balls to the pins, and then throw them over. The intention was, or the idea was, that when they hit the ground, the tennis ball would bounce and pull the pin out. Whether it worked or not, I don't know. But it built up the morale a bit, I suppose.
The battle against the U-boats was to continue right up until the end of the war.
I was flying the aircraft at the time in the first pilot's seat, and the second pilot was in the third pilot was in the second pilot's seat, and I remember after a while I was looking out, and I thought, that looks funny. There is a sort of wake, but it's against the wind lanes. Now, after watching, you know, nothing but wind lanes for miles and miles and hours and hours and hours, you took a little time to sink in that this is against the wind lanes, it's something suspicious. And at the same time, the front turret, flight engineer was in the front turret, called up and said, there's something up there, skipper. Well, I probably said pilot because I wasn't the skipper. And the third pilot in the second pilot's seat was also looking at the binoculars. And we all said, yes, we better have a look at that. And so what happened was, the skipper being down below, I pressed the buzzer klaxon thing we had, 3 short bursts for S for submarine, you see, ba-da-da-da-da-da. And I increased the revs and ran out the bomb trolleys. We had 3 depth, well, we had 4 actually. We had carried 8 depth charges, and we had 4 on under each wing, and they were run out from the centre of the aircraft, the fuselage under the wings, for each side. We only used to use initially 3 and keep 2 in reserve, so the 3 were run out each side, and I started moving into attack. The wake we'd spotted was about 4 miles on the port bow, actually, and by the time we sort of realised what it was, we'd passed it, and so we were making a sweep round to follow it round, and poor old Leslie Bavistock, I say poor old Leslie Bavistock, but he'd been on the loo, poor chap. And he heard this buzzer, and he came up, as I say, we called it the companionway. It was a little stairway between the pilot's seats in the front of the aircraft. He came up the companionway, pulling his trousers up, and we shouted to him to get his helmet on so we could plug into the intercom and find that someone put a helmet on his head. And then the third pilot, who'd been in the second pilot's seat, got out of the seat, and Barry got into the second pilot's seat, and he told me to keep bringing the aircraft round, which I did, and I was more or less positioning it up for the attack. And I remember thinking, well, this was before he got upstairs, or even after. I thought, am I going to be able to do this? I mean, you know, it was quite a moment you thought, I'm going to be able to do this, and then you thought, well, I wonder whether it would be better if he came up, and he knows it better than I do, you know. And so there was a mixed feelings as you were actually running in on the U-boat. And anyway, to cut a long story short, he took over on the run in, and you could see the periscope visually there. There was a periscope. We never saw any more than the periscope. And we attacked from about 50 feet. And there was a perfect straddle, 3 each side. They always reckoned that if you got, say, 2 and 3, numbers 2 and numbers 3 depth charges, 1 each side of the sub, it ought to be a kill. Unfortunately, we didn't get a picture of the straddle because we had what they called an automatic rear-facing camera, which worked when you pressed the bomb tit. It started recording pictures all the time, so it should show the complete sequence of the attack. Unfortunately, for some reason, although it had been tested, it was just taking blank pictures, and we never got a picture. But with a handheld camera, we got pictures of the bubbles and the plotting charts that came up, and the rubbish and the wood, and we homed naval aircraft onto the thing, and they confirmed it was a kill.
Flying boats also played a vital role in air-sea rescue. It was vital for the morale of the fighter pilots and bomber crews that they knew that every effort would be made to rescue them if they had to ditch in the sea. It's hard to imagine how grim it must have been for a ditched pilot or crew. Cold, wet, possibly wounded. The chances of survival were slim in the cold waters around Britain. Sunderlands and Catalinas played an important part in rescuing air crews. However, it was a small, ugly biplane that begun life back in 1921 that was to play a vital role in plucking Allied air crews from the cold grey sea. Called the Walrus, it had been designed originally as a fleet spotter. However, the Shagbat, as it was affectionately known by its crews, carried out a myriad of roles, from bomber to photo reconnaissance from Norway to the Indian Ocean. But it is for its service in air-sea rescue that it is most fondly remembered.
The trouble with the Walrus was that it was designed in about 1920, and it would have faded away but for the war. It was a very strongly built amphibian, which was meant to have a crew of 3. And when you even flew with a crew of 2 and landed and picked up 8 Americans, because they were always the heaviest, they were big chaps, clad in lots of clothing which was soaking wet. And by the time they got onto the aeroplane, you had to shut the windows, stop the sea coming in, because you literally only had 18 inches above the surface before you came to the window. And with all these 10 people on board, I remember trying to take off once like that, and I got as far full throttle for about 10 minutes, and I was doing 4 knots. And eventually we taxied all night and were picked up by a boat, by a motor gunboat who transferred all the Americans on. And then I couldn't take off because I was so full of water. So we taxied on into England with some fuel brought over. Very wet, very cold, not dangerous, but we had lots of fun.
From 1944, the Walrus was replaced by the Supermarine Sea Otter. Like the Walrus, it was powered by a single Bristol Pegasus engine. But the most noticeable difference was that the engine was now mounted in a tractor configuration instead of the pusher arrangement on the Walrus. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For Coastal Command, peace meant a rapid running down of forces. The Catalina squadrons were disbanded straight away, and the number of Sunderland squadrons, many of which were Commonwealth units whose personnel were immediately recalled home, was cut severely. The era of the flying boat was almost at an end, despite the best efforts of British manufacturers to revitalize this type of aircraft. In late 1944, Shorts had tested the Shetland. It was considerably larger than a Sunderland and was intended as a long-range, heavily armed flying boat. But the project was cancelled almost as soon as it flew for the first time. In the meantime, the basic Sunderland design was adapted for civilian use. These Solents and Sandringhams, as they were renamed, played an important role in re-establishing the long-distance routes immediately after the war.
The biggest flying boat ever to land on London River, this occasion was part of the commemoration of 30 years of British commercial air transport. Taxiing along at low water, the aircraft came up to the Pool of London and passed under Tower Bridge. Due to be christened City of London by the Lord Mayor and open to the public for visits of inspection.
A-1 jet-propelled flying fighter on her trials.
Arguably, the strangest flying boat ever to fly was the Saro A-1. It was intended as a jet fighter and included twin Metropolitan Vickers turbojets, a pressurized cockpit and ejection seat. It had excellent performance and speed, but after careful evaluation, service chiefs decided that the future of jet fighters lay with land-based types. In 1946, orders for 3 Saro SR-45 Princesses were placed. With no less than 10 engines required to lift this Leviathan off the water, the Princess was arguably the ultimate flying boat design. It had been intended for civilian use, but it was realized that the new generation of land planes that were on the way could carry out the same non-stop transatlantic service just as safely and more economically. The RAF showed an interest in the Princess as a long-range military transport, but the lack of a suitable power plant killed the project. In 1948, however, the Sunderlands of Coastal Command played a vital role in alleviating the blockade of West Berlin by the Soviets. Over 1,000 sorties were flown, the Sunderlands landing on the Havelsee, where they were able to unload 4 tons of supplies each time and take out refugees, many of whom were children. Landing on the Havelsee was fraught with danger, as the Elbe was full of uncharted sandbanks and wreckage. Also, the East Germans frequently floated logs and debris downriver in order to try and obstruct the flying boats. After the Berlin airlift was over, the Sunderlands went on to provide sterling service during operations in Malaya and Korea. The last flight of a Sunderland in RAF livery was in May 1959. It also heralded the end of flying boats in RAF service.
I think we did feel we were the Cinderella service. I mean, you know, I always remember sort of just after the war, people tended to say to you, what did you do in the war? And you say, oh, I flew with the RAF. And the next question was nearly always, were you on fighters or bombers? And when you said, oh, I flew flying boats with Coastal Command, the sort of jaw dropped and the interest seemed to wane a bit, you know. I mean, yes, I do think we did feel we were a bit of a Cinderella service. We had our own flying boat union, there was no doubt about that. It was a lot of camaraderie, and we were, like to think we were a sort of, you know, we're a bit select, but no, to the general public, we were certainly a Cinderella service, yes, yes. Not much publicity at all. That's why something like actually sinking a U-boat, well, I mean, you know, I'm still talking about it now 60 years later.
Today, despite the large numbers that were built, Sunderlands and Catalinas are a rare sight. Even rarer is the spectacle of one operating on water. Although there are a few airworthy Catalinas around the world, there is only one Sunderland that has flown in recent years. Today, it resides in the Fantasy of Flight Museum at Polk City, Florida, not far from Orlando. The collection was created by Kermit Weeks, and the Sunderland is one of his most highly prized exhibits.
The Sunderland behind me, we kind of look at as kind of our signature aircraft. It obviously is the most looming airplane in the hangar, and it certainly represents a very interesting, romantic, adventuresome part of aviation history. Of course, it was originally built as a World War II airplane, and it saw combat with 3 different countries during World War II. Originally the British, then it went to the Canadians, and finished up with the Norwegians. It was converted somewhere down in its history in Australia to a passenger flying boat, and that's the configuration that it's in now. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. It still has a little bit of the Sunderland look, but in fact it is the last 4-engine passenger flying boat that still flies. We've done some flying with it. We did in the Olympic torch relay for the Atlantic Games. We picked the torch up in Sarasota and flew it to Miami, and that was the last time we did any flying with it. But it's a very, personally, it's one of the most interesting airplanes that I love to fly. It's a crew effort. There's a lot of people involved to fly the airplane. It's a very It's an enjoyable challenge to my flying skills because there's no reversible propellers, there's no water rudder, and it's a great kind of a team effort. You kind of feel involved with a lot of people, and it's a lot of fun to fly. Once you get it in the airplane, it's like another 4-engine airplane, but the whole water experience with anchoring or mooring, looking for boats when you take off, it's kind of a crew effort, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a great challenge.
Flying boats were born of a different era when flight was still a novel experience. The epic journeys flown by the RAF's flying boats in the 1920s and 30s greatly enhanced the romance of flight that so captivated public imagination at a crucial time in the RAF's history. During the darkest days of the Second World War, flying boats flew for hours on end, patrolling the dark wastes of the North Atlantic, Mediterranean and Pacific Oceans, searching out the enemy's submarines that threatened below the surface. They brought food and essential supplies to many thousands of people in places where land-based aircraft could not go. And they took away the wounded, sick and vulnerable to safety. The flying boats may have gone, but there are many who have good reason never to forget them.
The marvellous thing was this little hiss that you got. You just touched at the bottom, and if you're making a good landing, you'd hear this psss. And gradually, as you settle north, I think that was a marvellous experience, that hiss that you heard just when you touched the water.